Back in the original release of Resident Evil 4, when Luis died in that game, I said, "Oh, that's too bad, I kind of liked him." And then I proceeded to completely forget about his character, which is also what the game did. The game's plot completely forgets that he ever existed and he is never mentioned again. But in the remake, when Luis dies, it hit me really hard. I felt terrible. I was honestly shocked by how much emotion I felt in that moment. It is a phenomenally well-crafted scene. The writing, the acting, everything that's built up to this, how it pays off later in the story, it's all genuinely really well done. I think it might be the best writing I've ever seen in any Resident Evil game. It's not just that they developed his character more, or that you spend more time with him, or that he's so likable. It's that there's a terrible tragedy in his death, but also this hint of optimism to be found in his final line.
But now, eh? What do you think, Leon? People can change, right?
Because that question, can people change, hits at the center of the whole human condition, doesn't it? The thing is, we all suck sometimes. We all hurt each other. We all make the same mistakes over and over again. So much of our storytelling is focused on that question, can we change? Can we be better? It's one of the most essential and most compelling questions of world literature. Go all the way back to the Epic of Gilgamesh and there's a story about this bad king who becomes a better ruler through his confrontation with the wild man Enkidu. Go all the way back to the Iliad and there's this story of the selfish warrior Achilles who becomes more human and more compassionate through his interaction with King Priam. This is a timeless theme that never gets tired because it's always relevant to our lives. So I want to follow Luis's story in Resident Evil 4 from beginning to end. Read every document, watch every cutscene, examine his obsession with the story of Don Quixote and what that tells us about him, and see how the writers crafted this character, how they made him so compelling in this remake. The story of Luis begins with this old cabin by the lake. Inside you can find this photograph of a boy and man. At this point you have no information about who either of these people in the photograph are, or if they are anyone important at all. The game only labels it as charred picture frame. Now, since I'm bothering to discuss it, obviously this is going to turn out to be a photo of Luis as a child, but you won't know that when you first find it. The remake has written a much more expansive backstory for Luis, but you have to find it on your own. You have to piece it together by investigating, by finding documents and old journals and photographs. The game isn't just feeding you his character through cutscenes, but also requiring you to engage with the story. They are mixing the gameplay with the story here, and this is smart writing. When you have a character with a mysterious background like Luis, it's much more compelling to give the player the experience of investigating and discovering that mysterious background for themselves. Imagine how much less interesting this would be if Luis just outright told you, in a long exposition dump, his whole backstory, all at once. It's the mystery and the investigation and the slow drip of information that makes the story compelling. It's a smart way to write his backstory, and I will discuss each of those documents and photographs chronologically as they appear in the game. Next, let's watch Luis's first cutscene. It's very short, but I have a lot to say about it. When you watch this short scene, think about what are Luis's character traits? How are they being shown to us? How is this character being introduced? What do the writers want us to think or feel about this character? So here it is.
That hurts, you know?
It seemed like you really wanted to talk.
How observant, senor. Now, say, you got a smoke?
You know, those things will kill you.
Oh, well, maybe just untie me then, huh? Joder, not this guy!
Who are you? Yeah, stop right there!
From the start here, I figured Luis was going to be his exact same goofy and campy self from the original. Those lines, "that hurts you know," and "hey, you gotta smoke," are such absurd lines to say in this situation. Like, dude, you are tied up in a sack, in a basement, in a village full of zombies. What are you talking about? At this point, there's no reason to think that Luis is going to be any different than his original version. There's no reason to suspect that he's going to turn out to be the best written character in the whole franchise. Of course, later we'll learn that he's locked up in the basement of his own childhood home. This is the cabin where he grew up, where he watched his grandfather get sick and die. We learn that he has a relationship with Mendez, that big guy who marches in to break some stuff. After you've pieced together his whole backstory, there is some emotional subtext here that's not readily apparent. I also want to notice Luis's reaction to Leon getting hilariously slapstick blasted through that wall. We get this very brief close-up of Luis's face, and he looks a little pained. He looks away. I think this is important to his characterization, how his character is being developed. He shows compassion towards someone else's pain. He looks like he feels bad when he sees Leon get hurt. So my question earlier was, what do the writers want us to think or feel about this character after this first scene? Well, firstly, I think they want the audience to be curious about him. He is immediately mysterious. He is an unknown. The circumstances that led him into this bizarre situation, being tied up in a sack in a locked basement in a village full of zombies, all of that is unknown. I really like this character introduction. You want to learn more about him after this. Secondly, the writers want us to laugh. They want us to laugh at the absurdity of this character asking for a cigarette before asking to be untied. We're meant to find him silly and goofy. And finally, there's that compassion he showed towards Leon. Beneath his goofy exterior, there is a compassionate character in here. I think those three character traits, mystery, humor, and compassion, which are already all present here in this very first short scene, are his defining character traits. They will be present in every single one of his scenes, and those will be the focus of my analysis of his character development. Now let's watch his second scene, which is quite a bit longer.
Oh, what the fuck? Hey, stop it. Hey, Yankee. Got your name?
Leon.
Quiet type, eh? I'm Luis Serra. Guess you, me, picked the wrongest spot to vacation, eh? Hey! Stop it! You move, I move. And I'm beat up enough as it is. I can see you're thinking. Bet you've been in spots like this before, huh? I guess you're here looking for someone. One more guess. Maybe some missing señorita?
Young girl. Talk. Now.
All right. See, heard chatter about moving a señorita.
Moving her. Where?
Who knows? But later, saw some men dragging someone to the old church. Hanging with you, not helpful.
Hey, we're not done here!
Later, amigo.
I want to begin with what is not included in this scene. In the original game, while they're tied together, Luis claims to be a police officer from Madrid who is captured by the cult. He does not tell this lie in the remake, though, and I think that's a really smart choice by the writers. Any explanation of Luis's backstory here, even if it later turns out to be a lie, ruins the mystery of his character, one of his essential character traits. The writers don't offer any explanation at all here of Luis's origins or his reasons for being here. When Luis claims to be a Madrid police officer in the original, the audience accepts it. He is no longer as mysterious. He is possibly just some cop who got caught up in all of this. But in the remake, the mystery remains. Somehow he knows who Leon is looking for and where to find her. We're going to have to investigate Luis's origins ourselves. Leon is far more suspicious of Luis in this version of the story. In the first game, he immediately trusts Luis. This new version makes more sense. You really shouldn't trust anyone you meet in this village. It also sets up a more compelling narrative arc for their relationship. Luis has to work to gain Leon's trust, and when Leon finally does begin to trust him, it feels like a moment of growth for both their characters, something both of them had to earn. I really like the animation on Luis as he backs away. His whole posture and facial expression are so smug. He looks like a total asshole here. And that's another core aspect of Luis's character. He has a smooth-talking arrogance. You get the sense that he thinks he could talk his way out of any mess. He's clearly very confident in himself. I don't think he ever once acts afraid or nervous during any of his scenes. He is always totally confident in his abilities right up until the end. So 2 scenes in, and we still don't know almost anything about Luis's backstory, but we do already have a pretty complete picture of his character. Mysterious, funny, confident, and at least somewhat compassionate. Luis doesn't show up in person again for another 3 chapters, but we can start to piece together his backstory through documents and journals and photographs. The first document we need to look at is a report sent by Leon's handler after she looked into Luis's past. Here it is. Name Luis Serra Navarro, age 28, gender male. Serra's name first appears publicly in a university student registry. No prior records have been discovered, including his birth certificate. After graduating from university, he was employed by Umbrella's research division, where he became a rising star who won favor among his peers. He was involved in the development of several common over-the-counter drugs, all of which were discontinued before ever reaching the market. See the attached list for details. A few years later, Serra resigned from Umbrella and could not be located. After the Raccoon City incident, efforts were made by law enforcement and the government to track down anyone with links to Umbrella, but despite conducting an extensive search, they were unable to find him. Considering how well he evaded them, we are almost certain Serra went to great lengths to disappear. Common over-the-counter drugs, do you seriously think Umbrella would let one of their best work on some antacid or beauty cream? Okay, first of all, if Luis is 28 years old, then I'm 12 and a half. There's no freaking way this guy is 28. But anyway, this report continues the mystery that is at the center of Luis's character. He appeared as if from nowhere, and then after a successful career, disappeared back into the ether as if he had never existed at all. This is all new backstory for Luis. In this remake, Luis was a researcher for the Umbrella Corporation, a star among his peers, which means he must have been involved in the development of dangerous bioweapons, some of which we've probably encountered in previous games. Once again, I think this new backstory is a really smart decision by the writers. It connects Luis to the rest of the series in a satisfying way. In the original, Luis is basically just some random guy, but by connecting him to Umbrella in the remake means he is now connected to the research lab at the center of the first game, and he is connected to the Raccoon City outbreak at the center of the second and third games. He is even connected to Wesker's grand plan in the 5th game. Resident Evil is a series of games, and in a series you want everything to connect. You want all of the pieces to fit together. You want every game to be part of a larger story. Before, Luis was just some random piece floating off on his own. Now, Luis is a snug part of the overall puzzle. It also complicates his relationship with Leon. Leon hates the Umbrella Corporation. After Raccoon City, he isn't going to trust anyone with connections to them. He was already distrustful of Luis. Now Leon's really not gonna like him. That means that in order for them to trust each other, to work together, their relationship is going to have to overcome this huge hurdle. And when it does, that will be a satisfying narrative arc. This is so much more narratively interesting than the original game's story, where they both just sort of immediately like and trust each other. The next document we need to look at is labeled as Old Man's Journal. 3 years ago, my beloved daughter passed away shortly after giving birth to a son. Since then, the boy has grown considerably. He is a very curious child and has a true thirst for knowledge. He even tries to follow after me when I go out hunting. I can't take my eyes off him for a second. Whenever we walk in the forest, he always asks me to tell stories. He's very fond of Don Quixote. The boy is smart and observant beyond his years. If he weren't stuck here, he might have become a scholar. I was a careless fool. I could have sworn I shot clean through the wolf's head, and yet it lunged at me. I was able to make it back to the cabin, but my wound is swollen and discolored. I cannot bear seeing the boy's worried eyes. My body moves on its own and I can hear voices inside my head. Am I going mad? I can't die now and leave the boy behind. Dear God, please protect him. You won't even know that the boy described here is the same one as in the photograph we saw earlier. You have to piece these things together on your own. You have to investigate, you have to explore, you have to engage with the story. At this point in the game, this note could be describing any of the characters or none of them. The first time I read it, I assumed it might be talking about Sadler or even Mendez maybe, or possibly neither of them. It could have been some other character. The game doesn't lay it all out for you in an obvious way, and that fits with the mystery, which is one of his central character traits. The best mysteries and stories are the ones you have to solve yourself, just so long as the writers have provided you with all the tools you need to solve it. The developers have written Luis with a new tragic backstory, in which his father was absent, his mother died in childbirth, and his grandfather was infected by the Plaga. This adds a new dimension to his character. All of Luis's confidence, his sarcasm, his humor, his goofiness, all of that hides a lot of darkness and trauma. You don't lose your entire family and be unaffected by the loss. Instead of his goofiness simply being a fun character trait, this new backstory makes it seem more like a coping mechanism for deeply rooted trauma. Laughter and sarcasm and humor are common responses to trauma. If you can't do anything about it and you'd rather not cry about it anymore, you might as well laugh, and that is Luis's character. There's also an added tragedy and irony in that Luis, with his research, will help spread the exact parasite that once infected his grandfather. We don't know the specific details of how and why Luis joined the Illuminados, whether he was ever a true believer or simply a man without any other options or something else. Luis's backstory, for all that it's been expanded in this remake, is actually still quite light on specific details. The writers gave us only enough detail to paint a broad picture of the story of his life, and that's a choice made by the writers and developers. They're making a bombastic action horror game, not a visual novel. How much time and space can they dedicate to this character's story? They need to pack in as much story in as little space as possible, and for how little space they had to work with, I think the developers did pack a lot of story in here. From this document, we also learn that Luis was an unusually intelligent and curious child, even to the point of risking his own safety. We know that he loved his grandfather, wanted to be with him, worried for him when he was sick. That's the compassion we see in Luis as an adult. He always cared about the people around him. Let's move on now. If you're a very thorough explorer and you return to Mendez's house with Ashley, which you have to go out of your way to do, the game will reward you with more of Luis's backstory. This document is labeled as Village Records 1, and it was written by Mendez. There is a young boy who lives in the cabin by the lake with his grandfather. It seems that his mother was called to heaven upon his birth. His grandfather doesn't talk much, but the lad is very bright and spirited. He told me a story about a knight who rides a donkey again today. The boy's grandfather has fallen ill and his condition worsens every day. The boy worries terribly about him, and there are rumors of a madness among the villagers. As I took my leave, the old man pulled me aside and said, "If anything happens, you know what to do." I could only nod in response. It was a terrible night. Everyone stood around the cabin and watched as it burned to the ground. The boy looked on without saying a word. Even as dawn broke, he didn't move a muscle. The next day, he was gone. This is the conclusion of the story being told in the old man's journal. The grandfather would rather die than fall under the control of the parasite. He asks Mendez to kill him, and Mendez acquiesces. Mendez kills the grandfather and burns down the house, while Luis looked on. With nothing left for him in the village, Luis left. He started a new life in the outside world. He went to university. He was employed by the Umbrella Corporation, became one of their star researchers. Later in his life, when he lost everything again, when Umbrella Corporation imploded, when he became a wanted man, he returned to the village, his old home, the only place he had left to return to, and he found it under the control of the Illuminados cult. And for some reason, he joined them, aided them in researching and spreading the very parasite which had killed his grandfather, which had once destroyed his old life. We can really only guess at his motivations here. Maybe he really believed in Sadler's cause. Maybe he believed a world controlled by Sadler would be a happy one. Maybe he didn't have any other options. Maybe, like so many others, he was just trying to survive for another day. There's another document to look at in Mendez's attic. This is the exact same photograph as before, except this one has writing on it. It says Navarro family, 1981, and it is labeled as photo of a boy and his grandfather. This is confirmation that the boy we've been learning about is Luis. This is a photo of him and his grandfather. Except I still didn't realize that when I first found this photograph. Like most fans, I know Luis as Luis Serra, because that was his name in the original. I completely overlooked that the developers gave him a second surname in the remake. His new name is Luis Serra Navarro, but I wasn't paying attention. So when I saw that photograph and it said Navarro family, I was like, who the heck is the Navarro family? It wasn't until Luis started talking about Don Quixote that I finally made the connection between the boy and him. That's a danger with this style of investigative storytelling. When you leave it up to the players to piece together your story, sometimes they will miss what should be an obvious detail and bungle the whole thing. I already had all of the pieces of Luis's story by this point of the game, but failed to put them together until much later. Alright, let's watch Luis's next cutscene.
Over here!
You.
Hey, listen, about earlier.
Yeah, about that.
Hey, I see you found your missing señorita.
Señorita has a name and it's Ashley. You are?
Name's Luis. Encantado.
Great. We all have names. Now then. Who are you? And what are you doing here?
Very good questions, unfortunately.
Hide, now.
In that case, here, help me.
Ashley, quick! Over here.
Go. Okay, it's game time.
And so begins one of the most famous set pieces in action video game history. I really can't overstate how incredibly scary and tense and cool this cabin fight was the first time I experienced it in the original game, and Luis is central to that. I think a lot of the reason fans liked Luis is less for his character and more for this specific gameplay segment, where you and he together fight off a seemingly endless and impossible horde of zombies in a very confined space. And he is actually useful as an NPC, a rarity at the time of the original's release. He draws the enemy's attention, gets some shots off, spouts off silly one-liners to diffuse some of the tension. This whole sequence is masterfully done, and I'm going to talk about it more in a later video, where I'll dig into how Resident Evil 4 crafts its particular style of horror. But this is a video about Luis, so we need to talk about him. Luis offers Leon and Ashley shelter when they are being chased by a horde of zombies, which speaks to that fundamental compassion within his character. When he sees someone in trouble, he tries to help. Unlike in the original game where Leon and Luis immediately start working together, here Leon is still very distrustful of Luis, which is understandable considering both of their histories with Umbrella. I've already talked about how this is a part of setting up a much more compelling and satisfying narrative arc for their relationship. Two characters who have to learn to trust each other is a much more compelling story than one about two characters who automatically trust each other without any work or development involved. And this cabin fight is a part of that. I also want to talk about the cutting of a certain line in this scene. In the original game, when meeting Ashley, Luis very famously says, "Well, I see that the president has equipped his daughter with ballistics too," while the camera zoomed in on her breasts. I think it's obvious why that line was cut. While it was funny because of how completely ludicrous and stupid it was, it also made Luis seem like a weird creepo. Don't comment on the size of a girl's breasts the very first time you meet her, man. That is tacky and lame. The writers want you to like Luis, and there is a significant portion of the audience who is not going to like him if he behaves like a sleaze. So while the game loses some of its campiness, I think this was a very smart cut. There's also a really clever mixing of gameplay and story happening during this segment. Not only is Leon the character learning to trust Luis, but so is the player. This is a very difficult section of the game. As is, it probably wouldn't be possible to complete if you didn't have this AI helper with you. He's not quite as effective at killing zombies as I would have liked, but as a distraction and a source of ammo, he helps a lot. You will develop a liking for him just because he helped you complete one of the toughest sections of the game. After escaping from the cabin, we get this scene.
Ashley.
What's happening to me?
Ashley, is this the first time you've coughed on blood like this?
You want to start explaining?
The cough, the blood, is caused by something called plaga. Okay. You saw those people, right? But you have the same thing inside you. The same thing that made them like that. This, what you're experiencing, these symptoms, they're only the beginning.
I don't want to become like them.
You are, well, lucky. You see, at this early stage, the parasite, the plaga, it is possible to remove it with a surgical procedure. And all you need is some know-how. And oh yeah, the right equipment.
Wait, you two?
No worries. See, I have a plan. But you're going to have to trust me. Great, we're partners then.
Hey, why are you...
No time for any questions. The clock is ticking.
Why are you helping us?
Because it makes me feel better. Let's leave it at that. I will contact you later.
In this scene, Luis mostly serves as a source of exposition. He's here to provide both Leon and the player with information about the plaga parasite, most of which is unnecessary. The player could easily figure out most of this for themselves. We do see more of that compassion at the center of Luis's character here. He is worried about Ashley, he offers help. We get a little more backstory too. Once upon a time, Luis himself was infected by the plaga, but conducted surgery on his own body to remove it, which is pretty freaking hardcore. We see more of his overwhelming confidence. He has a plan. He has it all figured out already. Just leave it up to Luis. Luis never fails. He very explicitly calls out what will be the central theme of his and Leon's relationship, learning to trust each other. But the most important thing we learn about his character in this scene is in that final exchange, when Leon asks, "Why are you helping us?" and Luis says, "Because it makes me feel better." This is Luis's central motivation in the story. He doesn't show it, but the truth is he feels terrible for the mistakes he has made. He feels terrible about helping Umbrella develop deadly bioweapons. He feels terrible about helping the tyrant Saddler spread the plaga. He feels like a shitty person because, judging him by the consequences of his actions, he is a shitty person. For all his likability, all his humor, how hard he works to correct his past mistakes, Luis really has done some shitty things. And feeling bad about those mistakes doesn't exonerate him. He has to redeem himself through his actions, and that is his motivation. No one wants to be a bad person. Everyone wants to be good. Everyone wants to be better. And that's what makes Luis such a compelling character in this remake, that desire to be better. Next is the scene where Luis and Ada interact, so let's watch it.
Hey, got a smoke?
I do. The kind you like. Now where's the amber?
Unfortunately, it's not on me at the moment. And you really should be telling me what a good job I did. Busted my ass and managed to hide it right before I got caught. Which is why I'm still alive.
The deal was, we get you out of here when you deliver the amber. No amber, no protection, Luis.
Such a stickler for details, huh, Ada? Okay, then. I'll go get it now. How about that? And I do have something else I need to get, too.
Luis is a character who wants to be better. He has made mistakes and he has a strong desire to fix those mistakes. And yet in this scene, we learn that Luis, like so many other people who are trying to be better, he can't help but keep making the same mistakes over and over again. Luis's greatest mistake is selling his talents and his knowledge to the worst possible people. First Umbrella and then the Illuminados. Even though he regrets doing that, here he is making the same mistake again. He is selling his talents and and his knowledge to Wesker, who is even worse than Umbrella or the Illuminados. This is very human behavior. Everyone does this. There is something about human nature that makes us do the same stupid things again and again. Luis is a flawed character. He isn't just someone who made mistakes in the past and is now trying to correct them. He is a character who is still making mistakes. That makes him a very human character. It's good writing. Moving on, in the castle section of the game, Luis calls Leon twice, first promising that he has the parasite suppressant, and then saying he got into trouble and needs Leon's help. Both times, Luis fails to actually show up where he said they would meet, further straining his relationship with Leon, further straining that developing sense of trust between them. After a pretty grueling adventure through the dark depths of the castle, Luis finally shows up, so let's watch it.
I'll make it cheap for you. Feeling better?
Yeah, seems like it worked.
Bad news? All we've done is buy you some time. The suppressant's effects will wear off all too soon. You ready to go?
Don't worry about me. Ashley is the priority.
In that case, we know what we have to do. Then come, Sancho Panza! Let us rescue the Princess Dulcinea!
You're gonna hurt yourself.
Hey, that was my dance. Okay, we hurry, I get it.
Luis has followed through with his promise to help Leon and Ashley. For all his past mistakes, this time he gets it right. This time he actually helps someone. We get a lot more of his silliness and confidence here. He's quite dashing. He doesn't hesitate to join Leon in his fight to rescue Ashley. And then we start getting the Don Quixote references. Luis makes a lot of allusions to the 17th century Spanish novel in his dialogue, specifically casting himself in the role of the titular main character. Anytime in any film, novel, or game, when a character starts referencing some famous work over and over again, that's the writers trying to tell you something about the character. In some way, the themes of that famous work will be relevant to the character's story. With these frequent references to Don Quixote, the writers of Resident Evil 4 are trying to tell us something about Luis's character, so let's see if we can figure out what that is. The novel Don Quixote tells the story of a possibly insane minor Spanish noble who is obsessed with stories of chivalry and adventure, so much so that he embarks on his own ridiculous grand adventure. However, the world is not as grand or honorable as he believes it to be, and as his adventures collide with grim reality, they mostly range from farcical to downright depressing. The novel has been interpreted by 10,000 different critics to mean 10,000 different things, but everyone agrees that the conflict between the main character's romantic but mostly imaginary idealism and the crushing realism that surrounds him is central to that meaning. So what does this have to do with Luis? Well, Luis is on a fantastical and impossible journey of his own, and he too doesn't realize how impossible that journey really is. He doesn't realize that he is living in a fantasy world. Luis really believes that he can charm and schmooze his way out of the terrible web he has weaved around himself. He believes he can manipulate or fight the Illuminados and Wesker and the whole world. He thinks he can betray everyone and anyone, switch alliances, make deals, and somehow, some way, it'll all work out for him in the end. His supreme and total confidence will carry him through every deadly obstacle. But he's wrong. That's just some fantasy he's living in. Like Don Quixote, he is going to be crushed by the realities of the world he lives in. Luis is a doomed character. Before the game even begins, he is already doomed. He is a dead man walking. He has doomed himself with his own decisions. His mistakes are just taking a while to catch up with him. His decision to work with Umbrella, then to work with the Illuminados, then to betray them and work with Wesker, these decisions have cost him his life. This is another thing that makes Luis's story so compelling to me. Resident Evil games have such ridiculous stories with ridiculous characters, who are all doing ridiculous things. But in the middle of all that absurdity, here is this single character who is facing real and serious consequences for his mistakes. The story is not going to let Luis go. It is going to punish him for those past mistakes. It's kind of a weird choice by the writers, to take his story in particular so seriously. It doesn't really fit with with all the camp and goofiness in the game? I think there's a simple explanation for this seeming contradiction in styles, which is that all writers everywhere, even those writing silly over-the-top action horror video game plots, want to write about something real, want to write about something important. Writers can't help themselves. It's in their blood to gravitate towards meaningful themes, and when done well, it can uplift any work, even something as silly as Resident Evil. The Resident Evil 4 remake is more memorable because it takes Luis's story seriously. It hits harder, it makes you feel something. But let's move on now because we've got to kill this Joker. From this scene forward, Leon and Luis spend a ton of time together. There's a very lengthy part of the game which essentially becomes a sort of buddy cop movie. There's all kinds of ridiculous action set pieces here, like this minecart ride or this fight against two trolls. This part of the game is super duper fun. Luis is a genuinely fun character to spend time with. He's constantly spouting off stupid one-liners and is genuinely useful in combat, if only as a distraction. After all the horror and terror and stress of the previous sections of the game, this section with Luis feels much more light and fun. It feels much more like a traditional action game. And Leon finally learns to trust Luis. By fighting side by side, by working together, by helping each other, they begin to trust each other, they become friends even. It's a delightful and satisfying development for their relationship's arc. Of course, it's all only a temporary reprieve. Luis is living a fantasy which must crash headfirst into reality eventually. So let's watch when his mistakes finally catch up to him.
We're out of that hellhole. The fresh air is calling our names. Por fin! Gus, if we made it all this way, you know it means we're almost...
Almost what?
Luis! Long time no see, rookie.
Major Krauser? What the hell? Why?
Recovering stolen goods. And killing a few rats along the way.
What follows is a long fight with Krauser, which I'm going to skip over to get to Luis's final scene, and then we'll have a lot to talk about.
Enough play, rookie. You haven't changed a damn bit. What a disappointment. Not looking good, eh, my friend? And such a loss to the ladies of the world.
Don't talk.
Take this. The key to my laboratory. Go there and remove those damn parasites. Help Ashley. You know, I led a pretty shitty life. But now, eh? What do you think, Leon? People can change, right?
Their relationship began with Luis ridiculously and kind of hilariously asking Leon for a cigarette, and now at the end of their relationship, Leon finally does give him that smoke, and it's not very funny at all anymore, but it does seal their friendship. I said it at the beginning of this video and I'll repeat it here, but this death scene hits really hard. It's because that final line, "Can people change?" feels so genuine, so authentic. This is such a true tragedy. And Luis's life is a tragedy. It took him too long to change. He lived the same shitty life for too long. He made the same mistakes for too long. Like so many people, he probably thought he had more time. He thought he would have more time to become that better version of himself tomorrow, or the day after, or the day after that. Next week, he could stop making the same mistakes. But time is the most limited resource of all, and Luis's has run out, just as it will for all of us someday. In the original game, after his death, the story completely forgot about Luis. He was never mentioned again. In this remake, his choices live on after him. For all his mistakes, he made at least one right decision, and that was to help Leon and Ashley. In his final act, Luis saves Leon's life, and then gives him this key. For the rest of the game, this key is in your inventory. Fast forward to the end of the game, and when you finally unlock the door to Luis's lab, and his surgical chair removes both Ashley and Leon's parasites, Luis has saved them for a second time. And this is part of what makes that death scene earlier, and his entire story so compelling. It's not just that his death scene itself is so well crafted, it's that there's so much payoff later. That death mattered. He continues to have a significant narrative presence in the story afterwards. Luis's lab also contains several more documents which tell more of his backstory, so I will end this video by examining some of those. First, here's a photograph labeled Group Photo, which shows a group of smiling scientists holding a banner with the Umbrella logo and the words, "Europe Laboratory 6 Dream Team." This is Luis's team of researchers from back when he worked for Umbrella. What catches my attention are the smiles on their faces, the excitement you can see in the expressions of these scientists. Umbrella Corporation are the bad guys of the first 3 Resident Evil games, responsible for an uncountable number of nightmares and atrocities. Whenever I picture Umbrella, I picture a bunch of scummy, cynical, profit-driven pieces of crap, who don't care who their research hurts so long as it makes them more money. But here we see a very different version of that company. Think about it from Luis's perspective. He had pulled himself out of nothing, out of nowhere, with no family and no support structure. When he was hired by Umbrella, it must have felt like the vindication of years of hard work, like he was finally catching a break, like he was finally being given the opportunity to excel in his field. He must have felt like his life was changing. He would have been excited, and you can see that excitement in this photo. However, at Umbrella, Luis's dreams turned rotten. He wasn't changing the world for a better there. He was creating lab-grown monsters. The next document we're going to look at is Sadler's Animus. Do not be fooled into thinking that Las Plagas are merely tools for creating powerful bioweapons. Their true value lies in their ability to control, no matter how hostile the subject. A single injection can turn anyone into a faithful servant. Who needs spies when you can turn yesterday's enemy into today's ally? Controlling just one insider can bring an entire organization, an entire country to its knees. Mass production of the superior species has made this possible. We have empowered Sadler. It is clear what he intends to do next. Can you imagine if Sadler had that much control? 6 billion loyal servants at his sole command. There would be no opposition, no war. Maybe for the first time in human history, the world would know peace. But I know how Sadler and the others have oppressed the people of this island for generations. I know how he treats them. That's no way to live, and because of that, I won't let it happen. In this message, I think we get a hint as to Luis's motivation to join the Illuminados. It's in that line, maybe for the first time in human history, the world would know peace. I suspect that, after the horrors of the Umbrella Corporation, Luis wanted to do good, and he genuinely thought he might be able to do good by researching the Plaga parasite. He saw the power it offered, how it could grant incredible strength and miraculous healing properties to those infected. I'm guessing he thought he could find a way to exploit those properties. However, over time he realized that the true purpose of the Plaga was its power to control. He realized that by bioengineering a superior species of Plaga, he had given Sadler the potential to rule the entire world. During his time with the Illuminados, he saw how Sadler treated those beneath him, the squalor and pain his servants lived among, and so Luis dedicated himself to stopping Sadler. He would have to use cunning, charm, manipulation, negotiation. He would have to betray the Illuminados, make deals with people like Wesker, put himself in great danger. It was this decision that truly doomed him. When he finally chose to do the right thing to stop a madman, that's when his fate was sealed. Finally, to conclude this very long video, let's look at the Amber. This sample, which I've come to call the Amber, was just sitting in the storeroom collecting dust. We used to have ample specimens for experimentation in the past, so it makes sense that this one was overlooked. In fact, the only reason I brought it back to my lab was because of its peculiar shape. After a basic analysis, I've changed my mind. The Amber possesses a very unique quality. Although small and in a suspended state, it contains the same organ found in the dominant species, which we've only seen in Sadler himself. When fully developed, the Amber may rival, or perhaps even surpass Sadler's power. Unfortunately, the Amber was confiscated by Sadler before I could make any further progress in my research. He may be on to me. I need to get my hands on that sample again and escape in order to continue my research elsewhere. It's the only way to counter Sadler. Of course, I don't think I can trust this outside group either, but I've already come this far. Hopefully, I can sweet talk my way out of this one too. I'll have to for the world's sake. Here we get an explanation for what that Amber, which Luis was trying to sell to Ada, and which Krauser killed him for, actually was. In the remake story, there are only 2 specimens of the dominant species of the Plaga in existence. Only 2 Plaga with the power to control all others. One of them exists inside of Sadler's body, and the other is suspended in that Amber. It's notable here that Luis never actually trusted Wesker's organization. He was always only using them as a means to escape, so he could continue his fight against Sadler elsewhere. The deal was that he would trade the Amber and his research in exchange for safety, but it was always a risk. It's also notable when he writes, "Hopefully, I can sweet talk my way out of this one too." That overconfident persona Luis puts on, where he acts like he can handle any situation on his own, is just an act. That word "hopefully" here reveals that he is only bluffing. He doesn't know if he can sweet talk his way through anything. He's just improvising. He never really had any plan at all. He was just taking advantage of the cards which were dealt to him. That is that Don Quixote imaginary idealism again. He was living in a fantasy and he knew it. He was never going to be able to outsmart Wesker. He wasn't even able to outmaneuver Sadler. If Leon hadn't come along, he would have been recaptured. He was always doomed. Luis never had a chance, but there is still something noble in his struggle. Most of the characters in the Resident Evil series are pretty shallow. They're either good guys or they're bad guys. If they're good guys, they basically only ever do good and fight for justice, and they always win. If they're bad guys, then they are unredeemably evil, only ever do wrong, and always lose. But Luis in the remake is something else. He's a good guy who has made too many mistakes to survive. He's an essentially compassionate character who has served nearly every single villain in the series, and that service ultimately destroys him. He is an overconfident smooth talker whose humor belies an inner trauma. He is kind but flawed. He is doomed by his own choices but also redeemed by them. He grew up in tragedy and lived among monsters, but in the end he still tried to do the right thing. He dies hoping for the possibility of change, for the possibility of being better, but never knowing if that belief was in something true or just another quixotic fantasy. For all these reasons, his is the most moving death of any in the Resident Evil series, and he the most tragic but ultimately optimistic of its characters, because he did change. His efforts to save Leon and Ashley go on to save everyone. In the end, his final act was the one that mattered most, because it's the only one of his choices that truly outlived him.
I don't get you. Why risk your life like this? You don't know us.
I told you. It makes me feel better.
Be straight with me for once.
Los Iluminados. I was working for them.
See? There you go.
Helping the two of you doesn't make up for it. I know that. But still, I don't want anyone else to get hurt.
In that case, you better get serious.
Harsh words for a squire.